think two of the kind of ways that most people probably know about his politics are the Vietnam trip and also the famous White House episode you just mentioned, What is Truth? I don't know how much time you have left, but if you could just kind of tell us, a little bit, because I think those things are really critical, the trip to Vietnam and the song, and then the famous episode with Nixon where he pissed Nixon off at the White House. So
Yeah, I think like this is a good example of how his views evolved over time, and the way that he empathizes um, could change over time. So like one thing is important to remember is that he's a veteran himself, right? He served in the Air Force for 4 years in the early 1950s. He's very much um, empathetic, sympathetic towards American servicemen, right? He also respects the power and authority of the commander in chief, right? Um, so for one thing, he goes to Vietnam to perform in January of 1969. In fact, the week that Nixon gets inaugurated, Cash is in Saigon performing like countless numbers of shows. And I found in the archives of the Overseas Weekly, this newspaper produced for GIs, that he says to the crowd at one of the shows of all these servicemen who are and there are recordings of this on the live bootleg #3 release. You can hear a sampling of songs that he performed in Saigon, but not this quote. This quote I had to find in the archives, where he says, I don't hang with these shitheads back home," meaning the protesters. Like he's not. This is January '69. He's clearly against the protesters, and he's here to perform for the soldiers, right? And later he talks quite movingly, or writes quite movingly, about how that trip really affected him, like the horrors of what he saw happening to American men, right? He's not often mentioning like what's happening to the Vietnamese. He's primarily moved by his own experience of people he knows losing their sons in Vietnam, and the American boys that he sees that are, killed and wounded and maimed in Vietnam. So he comes back, and this is just before the television show starts, right? The show starts in June of 1969. And he doesn't speak too overtly about Vietnam on the show in that first summer replacement season, but he starts to from the stage. He starts talking about that Vietnam War trip. And he starts using this cryptic line about how he thought of himself as a dove with claws, as a guy who doesn't really like, war, but he also gets kind of angry about like the protest against the American war and the effect that it has on the GIs. Then he goes so far as to say on television on the first episode of the second season in January 1970 that he supports Nixon, right? This is after Nixon gives the silent majority speech and talks about how, there's a vocal minority and that they're the only ones who can embarrass the United States as these protesters, and we need to unify for peace, blah, blah, blah. Cash seems to, take Nixon at his word, and he says on television, "I and my family support President Nixon's, plans for peace," right? Now, not long after he says this, he records the song "What is Truth," right? Which is, like I say, is the song about defending the right of protesters. So it's curious, right? Because here he is saying he supports the president, but then also he's defending the right of protesters in a way that it didn't seem like he was sympathetic to protesters the year before. But now he's had a chance to engage with a lot of people, to talk about the war and hear from young people. And so when he goes to the White House, he not only refuses to play these two kind of ugly songs that the White House asked him to play, which weren't Cash songs, Okie from Muskogee and Guy Drake's Welfare Cadillac, which is
yeah,
really,
a hideous,
a
just really,
racist song about, people on
really
welfare. And
Reagan's campaign.
totally, yeah, totally predicted Reagan's campaign. And then instead, Cash pauses in the middle of this concert in which he said he was to the White House audience that he hoped to show him a little bit about, the soul of the South. But then he totally departs from this, and about 15 minutes in starts talking about young people that he's met. And he plays "What is Truth," right, and says to the president sitting 10 feet away, "We hope, Mr. President, that you can end this war even sooner than you think you can." So Nixon clearly not expecting this. He's expecting like a country music ally to come perform at the White House. Something like Merle Haggard did a year later is what he's expecting, right? And instead, Cash brings up the war in all of its complexity, and at the time is Nixon's biggest problem from a public relations standpoint, obviously. So it's a pretty fascinating kind of shift. And just around that time, his next album comes out with a song called Route 1, Box 144, which is a really underappreciated song, but a fantastic barometer of where Cash stood on the war from the perspective of a guy who, a working class guy who goes off to fight the war and gets killed and leaves his wife and family behind. And that's totally how he relates to the Vietnam experience, including Jan Howard, the country singer's son, Jimmy Howard, dying, and who's obviously the model for that song.